So what is this picture?
The picture it shows how over time the public benchmarks, and a benchmark is a set of questions that can be used to test a large language model. What that chart is showing, the progress with AI models is such that those benchmarks are being saturated ever quicker. So it means that a test is not that useful if everyone can pass the test. So
I
at
see.
the top, there's a dashed line which shows sort of human level performance. If the AI is already above human level performance, then we need harder benchmarks and harder tests. So from the left to the right, you can see that the slope of the line becomes closer to straight up, where the models are a combination of them getting better, but also they are training for the test. So often the test questions and the answers are on the internet. And so there's leakage of the answers to the questions. That data is leaked into the internet. And so the models end up being trained, given the answers through their training.
So basically what it means is they are not necessarily, it's not a very good measure for how these technologies advance
Yeah,
because it's kind of biased. It's sort of they are good in being prepared for these tests or
this
in
goes,
preparing themselves for these tests. And therefore the tests are not really very meaningful anymore.
they become open book tests. They start out as closed book,
Right.
they become open book tests, and then they become less useful. And that's happening
Right.
quicker.
So what does it mean?
I think
What are the implications? So, you know, what does it mean?
it means that we need harder tests
And so we need harder tests.
and private
And
tests.
how can we, how to develop these tests?
Well, I think there's a few different ways. There's two ways I can think of right now. One of them is you use human experts to create the questions, and they are in their office in front of a whiteboard. They draw out a complicated question and then capture that electronically, but it never goes online, never goes on the internet. So it's always kept private.
Hmm.
And when you want to test an AI, you have to bring the AI into the testing facility, whether virtual or even real. Maybe it's offline and you're able to access the model in a particular way that's secure. That's one way. The other way is you constantly change the questions. So you cycle the questions. So if it was a particular scenario that involved numbers or a market size or some timings or some numbers of some kind of calculation, you constantly cycle the numbers in the formula that formulate the
Hmm.
question so that the AI, to make sure it was actually answering your question and calculating it,
Hmm.
not just repeat an answer from a training data set.
Right.
If you constantly change the parameters each time the question is asked,
And this is not done right now. So this is what you're saying. Basically, the tests that are applied today don't do that. They really are developed in a way in which what makes them, is the right word, is it conducive? Or that there is the risk of, or there's actually the high probability that the models will be particularly trained for especially those tests so that they perform well.
right? So there's this quite famous law. There was a British economist in the 1970s, Goodhart. There's something called Goodhart's law, which is if a measure becomes a target, then it loses the value because the tests and the benchmarks and the models align with each other so that they get really good at passing the test or beating that target instead of these exams being a genuine assessment of how good these things are in the real world. So the issue is, and I think it's happened already, and you may have experienced this using ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, is that they might score incredibly high on a benchmark that has PhD level maths questions. But then when in the real world you use that product and ask it a simple question or a particular maths calculation, maybe for a tax return or some household bill calculation, and it gets it wrong, you think, what's going on here? This model is PhD maths, right? So why is
Right.
this challenging? So you get this divergence between
Mm,
the benchmark score and the real world.
right. Talking about my own experience, I don't think I use it often enough. I really try to make it part of my routine to use the AI, these large language models. But I don't think it's a very large part already. I think it should be higher because I really believe that otherwise we're getting old and we don't learn what's kind of bringing us forward now. Then it's like with previous generations, if they haven't bought a computer or not denied having a smartphone or something like that, then somehow you're missing an important part of this, of what kind of pushes the technology frontier and what you can do and your efficiency and so on and so forth. Yeah, so
Yeah,
I really try to make it part of my routine, but I don't think I'm where I should be this stage. How much of you, what would you say? How, in terms of maybe minutes per day or per week, how, what would you say? How much do you use these large language models?
I would say I use them as an assistant alongside me just all the time. So all day. If I'm working here all day, then I will have Claude Code, which is a software developer agent product running on my machine. And I'll be building a prototype. I've got one for an event coming up next week, Airspace World. And so I'll be using the prototype. It's a fun aviation quiz, no surprise there. But I'll be looking at the user interface, thinking of problem, finding errors, debugging, fixing it, and then giving the instructions to Claude Code to try and help fix the.
Hmm,
And then if I have a proposal to write, so I've been putting in applications for various things or writing blogs, I would never trust the AI to do the whole thing alone.
right.
But for me, and everybody will have their way of doing it. For me, I tend to hit record on my phone and I will record myself just thinking out loud the topic for an idea, right? For an article,
Hmm.
something like that. And I'll just talk for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and just get that idea out of my brain, a transcript. And then I will go to an AI, give it the transcript, give it the context of what is it my personal Substack? Is it my business blog or something like that? I'll give it the say, this is Alex or informal, or this is needs to be more formal and more professional in tone. And then it'll help me structure those thoughts.
Interesting.
And then I edit everything afterwards, read everything a couple of times, edit it, change many things, because often, for me anyway, maybe I'm not using it correctly, but I still have to remove duplication. Usually AI gives me two or three conclusions to everything.
Hmm.
I can delete, trim it right down. So maybe that's my prompting or lack of skill in using it that means I
Interesting.
have to edit so much.
Yeah, I think that's a good advice, actually, how to use to try to make it better part of your daily routine and productively use it to manage the tasks that you have to do. But let's get back to this picture and the saturation.
Okay.
I'm
Yes.
wondering, what does it mean does it have some implication, especially for aviation? So now we have so my understanding is there are some large language models, they are tested, they perform pretty well, and we all think that they are good. But when we're looking at those assessments, they may not be as good as we may think based on the results from these assessments. And so now this means that perhaps we have to think about ways in order to change the assessment, the procedures, that it becomes more objective. But no, where we are right now, what would it mean for aviation applications? What would be the implication? Are there any specific implications for use cases for aviation for which this kind of plays an important role?
I think the first thing, the very first step is the metric, the scores that the different models have against these benchmarks. So maybe GPT 4o from OpenAI and Llama 4 Scout, maybe both those models score over 80% on the graduate level Q&A for physics, chemistry, and maths. I think that's pretty impressive because that benchmark, let me get the acronym right, GPQA, that benchmark's pretty hard. It's set by PhD candidates. They're hand-created questions that are hard. So if any model is scoring highly on that benchmark, it has to be really smart. But that first step is, I would say, take those scores with a pinch of salt and don't just believe, therefore those models will be great for my aviation use case. It's a good start, but it's actually not that relevant. As soon as you use that model from any of the providers, again, in a real world context, a real question, particularly for aviation, because none of those benchmarks, apart from some of the work that we've been discussing, those benchmarks that are out there are quite academic. And there's nothing wrong with that. They're very good. They're very interesting. But they are trying to measure a sort of general intelligence against academic subjects. They are not industry specific. They're not aviation or transport or travel specific. So none of the questions.
And I think this is exactly where, as far as I understand, you reached a milestone achieved a milestone in the recent past, so to say. And I think this is where what we have been discussing right now is really very closely related to what you just said when we're talking about assessing those AI models and in the context of aviation. Am I right?
Yes, exactly. So this is some of the work that I've been doing and we've been discussing as well within for Airside Labs. What we've created is a hand-curated set of questions. We've created a benchmark that is specific to aviation. It's very much just the first step, I think, because this is a hard problem and it's a broad problem. But what we've created is a version 1 of a benchmark called pre-flight, and it's 300 questions across a range of topics from the ICAO annexes and what do they mean and what do they apply to, through to a set of questions for a flight dispatch role, types of decisions they have to make, and then some airport ground operations, questions around the procedures, how do you do things in a safe way, what are the rules and training paradigms for those roles on the ground at an airport. So the idea is to cover some of those broad topics within aviation to see how good the models are.
And how good are they?
Well, it's quite surprising. They're pretty good. And the benchmark scores, some of the
It's open source, right? If I understand correctly, it's
yeah.
open source. So have the models already been trained on your questions or not?
I think that will happen. I'd be surprised if they're trained already. It's only been a month. Maybe they've been scraped. The data set is on Hugging Face, which is a popular platform for data scientists to share generative AI test sets and models. So it's up there, it's open source with an MIT license, so anybody can download it, contribute to it, raise issues. If there's questions there that are not good enough or have errors, please encourage anyone to make a comment on Hugging Face, and we can then prioritize and fix and make the data set better and better over time. That's what we're going to do. But yeah, it's surprising how good the models are. I think, and we're writing this up as a paper, but my intuition is that aviation has always published the standards freely on the internet. So very early on, the EAIP is published online. Many of the core document sets, some of them you have to pay for for a nation state looking to support safe operations in their country. There are some fees to pay ICAO and buy the documents. That safety first culture of aviation, of using open standards, has meant that a lot of the rules and regulations are published online and are available to be scraped and used in training data sets. And I think that's what the large language models have they're starting with a high level of understanding.
So that means that this is sort of indicating that their aviation is a good place to use these kind of models.
Yes, good place to start. They understand a surprising amount. So they score above 50% on the benchmark. So they're getting a score. What great.
If we look at the illustration, the saturation, I think the threshold is 80%. Is that, do I remember correctly?
80. Yes, for those benchmarks, the human level is 80. What we're doing with pre-flight is gathering data from people. We're encouraging people to have a go at answering the questions. So we're gathering crowdsourcing data. And actually, we'll be doing that in Lisbon next week at Airspace Worlds, encouraging people to come to the stand and have a go at the quiz. So that will give us the human baseline of an aviation professional,
See, and
help us gather more data. At the moment, we don't have enough human contributors in terms of answering questions,
right.
but we're getting.
So these are not standardized thresholds, but it's basically case dependent. And in your case, the threshold that reflects human abilities or knowledge or general understanding could be then 50% based on what you're having and not 80% as with the other tests.
Exactly right. Yeah. So we are approaching it with humility, and we are out there gathering real data and trying to encourage people to take we're not calling it a test, it's a quiz. So we're exploring this new technology together and trying and following a sort of empirical method to gather that data. So at Airspace World, they will be aviation professionals within the industry. And so we think that's a great place to get started and gather some human.
What kind of event is this in Lisbon?
Oh, so it's literally next week, Airspace World. It's the annual, and there's actually going to be a second event now each year, but it used to be once a year. It's all the sort of air traffic management providers and suppliers, so air traffic control, air traffic management, the ANSPs across the world gather for this event. It's the event where CANSO, so the trade association, it's a series of meetings and engages the whole group of stakeholders and the big suppliers of air traffic control.
So to what extent do the air traffic management or air traffic controllers use large language models?
Nothing right now. So there's nothing in operations that uses LLMs in ATC whatsoever. And I very urge extreme caution before bringing that to ATC. But there's loads of other use cases around the analysis of traffic flows, the analysis of the market, analysis of different use cases and training.
Air traffic managers or air traffic controllers, they do a lot of things. I think this is what you just
right.
said. We're now talking about basically the day-to-day traffic management, making sure that there are no accidents and so on and so forth. But then they also, it's a business unit, so they have to do other things as well. And I think in those areas, this is where these tools can play a role as they can be in, because they are used basically for all businesses or anyone can use them. And I think then, or air traffic management companies should be using them or
for
as
sure.
well.
Absolutely. Right? There's so many use cases across if we called them desk-based use cases, there's lots and lots of knowledge-based tasks across procurement, across invoicing, planning. Huge opportunity.
And also data analysis, because I think the amount of data that is created by air traffic is enormous.
Absolutely. And for tailoring training for staff. So staff shortages are a big issue across the industry. So understanding how to train people more effectively and using LLMs and AI to help with that kind of training as well. I think it's going to be a big area in the future.
So we just recently recorded a different podcast with Abhishek Krishna from Amadeus. And he was mentioning that, for instance, these models can help improving controlling the roads that are used by aircraft, so that noise emissions could be reduced, or for instance, fuel emissions could be reduced. Or we could also think about perhaps non-CO2 emissions, like the generation of contrails, so that the roads will be designed in a way so that they avoid the generation of contrails, for instance.
Yeah, I heard that discussion. That was a really interesting conversation that you had. And I think this is where thinking about a wider system could be really valuable. So undertaking a modeling effort to calculate noise levels, acceptable noise levels and thresholds, and then understanding how the traffic is going to move and what that means for people living in and around an airport and for the environment and wildlife.
Mm.
There are very good tools out there already.
And those are used by, but do you
Yeah, exactly.
know what they are used, right?
Oh, absolutely. But I would put them categorize them as deterministic, complex algorithms and models that are fantastic and very sophisticated. And I think where generative AI can play a part is in those using those tools. So if we define a particular set of algorithms or a modeling activity, that activity can be triggered or treated as a tool and triggered by a large language model AI. So if you imagine an agent or a large language model with a context and a memory trying to undertake a task, to complete that task, that agent can utilize a number of tools at its disposal. And so something like a noise abatement or a noise mitigation model could be one of
Hmm.
that,
Right.
that the AI agent or even the large language
Mm.
model can connect to and use and look at the result.
And I think what Abhishek mentioned called deep learning. I think he mentioned these different layers. This is my feeling. I actually also looked it up, and it's a little bit in preparation for our discussion right now. That really like the deep learning, I think, is when we talk about the large language model is sort of an example for deep learning, basically, which is a subset of machine learning, a more sophisticated big data approach. So I'm still trying to understand all these categories and basically what that means.
Me too. I'm not a data scientist by training, and these are complex topics with sub specialities. And
Mm,
I'm not an expert on deep learning itself, but I do understand that when training a model and articulating a reward, and so the model is being trained and it's trying to modify its parameters, its situation in order to achieve a reward is part of the concept around deep learning. There are issues with that, and I've read about things like reward hacking. It's actually a funny story around that where it's linked to robotics, and some very early researchers created a robot in their lab that had
hmm.
cameras. So it had two cameras and it's a little bot, and it would collect, it had a little vacuum cleaner like a Hoover, like a Roomba, if you remember Roomba.
Hmm. Yes.
And look, they programmed it to drive around the lab, you know, collecting the dust and dirt from the floor in the lab. And so these data scientists created a reinforcement learning, a deep learning model where the goal was that the two cameras on the little bot could not detect any dirt in the environment. Hey, that seems pretty sensible reward, right? There's no dirt. If you look at the camera feeds and there's no dirt that's detected, that's a clean lab. But this robot, when they created the environment, they set up the deep learning environment. I apologize if I'm using reinforcement learning and deep learning in the incorrect context. But what the model did was, instead of cleaning the lab, the robot simply disabled its own eyes.
Oh,
It was in a blank feed.
so that he doesn't see that it's dirty, and then if it's not dirty, then it must be clean.
So it achieved the
Interesting.
goal by disconnecting its camera feeds because it met the goal. And so I think what is the interesting lesson from that? Be careful how we construct the rewards because the model will find if there's a way to shortcut achieving the metric or the goal, then it will do so.
Well, as an economist, this is incentives and the unintended consequences of your creative system of incentives. And the outcome, there's always a good chance, sorry, that the outcomes or the behavior of the people involved will be very different from what you hope or expect because it's difficult to foresee all these the interaction of all these terms and what it kind of gives at the end. And that's a big topic for me that I try to teach my students and or that we as economists also I think try to convey to anyone who is interested in this. If you think about regulation, for instance, that some type of regulation, price regulation of airports can create incentives to just reduce service quality, for instance, or it can create incentives for overinvestment, or all these kind of things that can happen. It seems that this is something similar. So here you have also the kind of these AI models have certain objectives, and if you set them wrong, then they may be pursuing certain that may create a certain behavior that is really not what was in line with what was intended.
That's absolutely right. What are the incentives? And I think if the incentive is to simply get over 80% on one benchmark, then the model will have aligned itself to score to get that score, the target. And the so that's not
And
really.
also, on top of this, in ways which will perhaps not be sort of be in line with what people were hoped they would be doing, right? What
Oh,
you
right.
want is that they improve their understanding and then they perform better. But maybe they can find ways to perform better without necessarily improving their understanding. And this is, of course, something
That's right. You see,
is not what you want to happen.
in that scenario, what do we want? I think we want the large language models, the vision models as well, and the audio ones. We want the models to actually understand the question that's being asked and to actually think it through and give its best answer. And we want the AI to say if it doesn't know, but to actually say, I don't know. We don't want it to make something up.
So how can we do that? How can you program or model the models so that they behave in that way? Can you,
No,
is there seems a risk that you
yeah,
may not be achieving this goal?
it is a risk. Yeah, nobody knows yet how to create that AGI, artificial general intelligence, that is actually thinking through every question and isn't just, it's called parroting, but it isn't just repeating back to you some
Mm.
data from its training data. There's some amazing papers have been written fairly recently by Anthropic, where they've been trying to explain how, for them, it's their large language model called Haiku. Their model is actually coming up with its answers. How is it answering a question? And is it thinking things through? And as they've written up this paper, I'm sure we'll share the link afterwards. But they came up that they showed how there's some really amazing structures within the AI that have been created. In particular, they had one example where they were trying to work out if the AI was just going from one word to the next when coming up with an answer. And they're so smart. They used poetry. They were asked the model to write some poetry. And so what they tried to work out was, does the model actually plan ahead when it's trying to create rhyming poetry in particular? So when the last word of each line rhymes. And they were able to show that when the model reached the end of one line, the first decision, it actually decided what the rhyming word was going to be before it wrote the line leading up to that word. So it created, so it said that maybe it was mice, and then it decided that in the context of the poem, the rhyming word on the next line would be perhaps rice. I can't remember the exact words. Then what it did, it created a plausible line of poetry that ended with the word that it had already chosen. And so what they were
Mm.
showing was that the LLM was actually doing very short-term planning. So it made a decision it decided that was the goal, that the line should end with that word, and then it created a plausible sentence leading up to it. So if it's doing
Interesting.
that on a single line, is the AI doing that at a higher level structure, at a paragraph structure level, at a page level? Has it decided a conclusion? And then is it creative filling in the steps leading up to that conclusion? Because then that shows some quite interesting level of understanding of what it's doing. Really, that's pretty exciting. That's quite interesting in terms of that's Anthropic have released those papers. That's just so interesting to me. But it links to the benchmarks in that we want them to think through the questions. We don't want them to just memorize all the answers to the benchmark and score 100% every time.
All right. So now you're going to Lisbon and you get much more information. You're better in refining or in determining the threshold so that you can tell, oh, now how good are these large language models in understanding aviation markets? The way you describe the aviation markets based on all these ICAO standards and so on and so forth. And then let's say they perform relatively well. Then, of course, if they do not perform very well, then the idea is okay, so they have to learn more. But what if they perform relatively well? And this is basically what I think your result until now, right? That so far, it seems as if their understanding is relatively good. So what will be the implications? How
I think,
for aviation professionals?
well, I think relatively good is not good enough for any real decision. Anyone who's used ChatGPT and Claude and has asked the models questions in an area that they know about. So if they ask the models questions about their own industry or their own business or things they really know about,
Hmm.
very quickly you realize that the model is trying to create plausible answers to your questions, but doesn't really know. How could it
Hmm.
know about your own business, or how could it possibly know? Because the information's commercial, or maybe it's kept in an enterprise system, it's not on the internet. And so that's a clue to, I think, what's really needed is the best kind of AI would actually understand your data and your context and your business or your organization. And so when you're
This would then be individually trained AI models, right? Because they have to be trained basically on data that would not be publicly available.
Well, it doesn't have to be trained. It could be, but that's very expensive to train a model
Uh-huh.
from scratch. But you can provide that contextual data to the AI as part of your question. So you can assemble what's called a RAG system, retrieval
Mm,
to generation, where in a system you give it your question, but as part of that, what your system will do is take your question, understand its meaning, grab relevant data from your documents or your business data, and then put that together with your question and give that to the model.
so basically, what you're saying is what you can learn from those results that you have produced with what you have developed is that you could give some advice on how to use these large language models so that you can
Yeah,
then expect better results.
that's right. It's how to use an AI within a system and how to create your own tests to verify the answers that come back will include your proper data, your
Hmm,
especially
I
sensitive.
see. And you decided to do it open source. Why open source?
Well, I've been working in the aviation industry a long time, like yourself, and it's only through collaboration between the stakeholders you can get something to really work. So airports have to work with airlines, both operationally, but also at a human level,
Hmm.
to work how do you recover from irregular operations, how do you manage safety, but also on the ANSP side, collaboration between airlines, ANSPs, and airports, and between airports and ground handlers. There's so many links between different organizations. It's very
Hmm.
complicated. And so any kind of data-driven collaboration and understanding about AI, I think has to be collaborative. So the first step I felt was let's make something open source and allow people to contribute hard questions to the benchmark. And then anyone can
So is it so that means really that people can, when they have some questions, they can just add or modify those questions and work on the basically on the code.
they can run the tests themselves. So they can
Mm,
spin up a Python command
right.
line. They can
Mm,
install the packages and then run the test on their local model within
mm,
lines, or run the test against any online model they like. And
mm,
what we hope is that people will spot mistakes and that they'll come up with questions that are not in the benchmark. They will contribute them in. We will manage them. We will control all the versions. We will continually improve it and
hmm.
manage that project on behalf of the community.
Have you got some feedback already? Some suggestions
I,
for
I
questions and
I have had some feedback. In particular, some of the questions need to be improved. Some of the questions are not quite hard enough yet. Some of the questions are a bit ambiguous, and so they're not, how would I say, we need to make them more fair and of a higher quality. So the questions are multiple choice, Sometimes, particularly in things around some of the questions cover different types of weather events like thunderstorms
Mm.
and turbulence. And so the questions need to be hard, but also fair, so that even the human and the AI have a fair chance. If they know the answer, there's a clear option, and it can only be that answer.
Well, as a university teacher, I know that producing a set of questions that are unambiguous in a sense that are clear enough so that the students, if they have studied, properly studied, are also then able to answer the question properly and not, oh, the question is confusing. Does he talk about this particular issue or about something else? Then things
Yeah.
become, there are ways in which I would recommend students handle this, say, but yes, that's something you're trying to avoid. You're trying to be very clear, but it's not a trivial thing to do. And I think this is also what you're just highlighting.
Oh, exactly. And I think that's part of the value of the work is that it's quite easy to write an open-ended question. The answer could be a whole page discussing various factors. And then some
Mm-hmm.
of the tests, what they do, they use large language models to be the judge, to mark the homework, to mark the answers. So you have an open-ended question and then perhaps a model answer that an expert has written.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is LLMs tend to score answers that correspond to the way they work, the way they articulate the answer. They score them higher. So the OpenAI models score OpenAI, other OpenAI models higher versus
Mm-hmm.
Claude or Llama or other or Quen or DeepSeek. And so it's really
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Using an LLM to mark the homework is actually really difficult and causes
Mm-hmm.
lots of problems because they prefer their own answers. So what we've done for our project is we've spent more time trying to make the questions harder and more complicated and rich. So the question might describe a snow clearance scenario and give times and stand numbers and things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
then the way the answer is given is multiple choice. Is it A, B, C, or D? Or E, none of them, no suitable option. So that we've tried to move the intellectual effort into the question and not have something open-ended that then requires quite complicated scoring. So the scoring for our benchmark
Right.
is very simple.
Yeah, but of course you're right. This I totally understand that it's more demanding, and then designing the question is more demanding, but then assessing the result is simpler because this is multiple choice, and you say, oh, it's easy to check. Where is the check? Are there too many, or is there the wrong places, and so on and so forth? That's very easy to check, but coming up with a set of questions is something difficult, and this is an advantage I understand of this open source approach because then people can contribute to this, to improving the set of questions. And then, so that seems.
So the idea is that I'm accepting contributions now. So the message is, the invitation is out there, follow up. And we're looking for inputs and hard questions to come into the benchmark, but we're actively improving the questions. We're adding to them all the time, improving the
Hmm.
quality, and running that under tight configuration management. So they're very
But
specific.
the number of questions always remain the same, or are you also changing the number of questions?
So we're a bit of both. So we're improving the quality of existing questions, and then we're adding more questions in to cover different topics. My background is more on the operational side of
Mm-hmm.
flying and air transport. It's just where my career has been. And so that felt like a starting point where I could be a bit of an expert at the start. What we're looking to do is bring in other topic areas. So we've been discussing airport economics and the more economic side of things. And so we'd be interested in bringing in those kinds of areas, but also other sub-sectors of the market of aviation and create sets of questions and benchmarks for that too.
So I'm trying to understand all the implications. So we started talking about assessing large language models and the saturation, and then in a sense that it seems that all the models are performing pretty well, but then there is also the issue that maybe that assessment is not very good because the models are basically trained or have been trained so that they can do well in particular those assessments, but it doesn't necessarily reflect advancements in those areas. And then there is this issue about now we are specifically interested in understanding not just their general understanding of the world in general, but rather about aviation. And this is where you have this sort of questions in order to perform those assessments and to see how large language models do in terms of their understanding of the aviation world. And the what you need to do for this is first you need to find a good threshold. So you need more people responding to those answers so you can get a more precise sort of threshold for the human ability in a sense. You also need to improve the questions so that the interpretation of the answers are easier. And then once you get a good result, so how these models do in terms of their understanding of aviation compared to humans, then this can be used in order to help people improve their interaction with large language models. Because if they don't have a poor understanding, then you need to be more sophisticated in your prompt design, right? I think this is what it's called. You need to give them either more or less context. If they are performing extremely well, you don't need to think much about providing background information, for instance. Whereas if they do perform poorly, then you need to invest more effort in your question design or prompt design. So
Yeah,
is that basically
I think that's a really good summary. That's a really good summary of yeah, the topics and the discussion that we've gone through. I think one area that we haven't covered is as these models are changing. So it seems like every week or every 2 weeks, a new model comes out, is released, that's supposedly better than the last one. There are different kinds of models, some that I can run on my machine here in my home office, and
hmm
others that have to run in a data center.
hmm
So understanding how using a range of benchmarks and tests and questions against a model, but then when you need to upgrade your system and you say, right, we've got a new model, put the old one away, we've got a new one, let's slot that into our system. And then we need to run all the tests again to see if there's an improvement in terms of the core model's ability and its understanding. So there's over time,
It's basically maintaining the AI system, if you wish.
exactly because
This is where the assessment, understanding the capabilities is important because if it's pretty capable, maybe there's no need to invest the effort in upgrading in a sense or
yeah, exactly.
uh,
You want to upgrade, or the new model may appear. I think even last week, OpenAI upgraded GPT 4.0 in terms of
uh-huh,
its ability and conversational style. And
uh-huh.
everyone, there's lots of discussion on X and elsewhere that people really didn't like that new version. It changed the way that it answered questions, how it interacted with people. And so OpenAI rolled it back. They undid the change. And I think it's similar for us in any industry, actually. It's not specific to aviation, but having
Mm.
got a good version control on which model you're using, and then if a new one potentially could be used and adopted in your system, running all the tests first and seeing is this actually better or is it a step backward? And I think that's the important part of it is the longitudinal testing. So over time, how do we manage this stuff?
So basically, one lesson that I try to draw or that I drew from our discussion was prompt design, right? How do you need to, you learn from what you have done could help others, aviation stakeholders, improving their interaction with AI models. What you're saying is there is another issue in which it can also help aviation stakeholders, and this is you can check whether it's really worthwhile getting into higher versions or other versions or using different tools, because then this also, of course, relies on Can you expect an improvement in terms of the understanding of the usability, I would say, of these AI models, right? For whatever the professional use would be.
Exactly right. So if we take an example of a customer service chatbot, and whatever business you're in, if you have a customer service chatbot, you want it to follow the policies and the rules that you have as a business, whether people are allowed to get refunds,
Right.
the cancellation, what are the terms and conditions of the things that have happened, what's available. And so the business in creating that chatbot, either it's used off the shelf or maybe they fine-tuned a model themselves, or maybe they're using an enterprise model that they have within their infrastructure that they've controlled or maybe even trained from scratch.
With they, for instance, airlines, because
Yeah,
I feel
like
that
airport travel company, many airlines and airports have chatbots now on their
I
website.
think this is an important application also, really, of
Well,
these
it's a
for
very,
these models, right?
I think it's definitely the first set of use cases that many of these companies have used Gen AI for is a customer service chatbot. And there are success stories. There are some horror stories as well where the chatbots have made a mistake. But I think in terms of testing and benchmarking, understanding if a new version or a changed version is either better or worse.
But do I understand it correctly that your set of questions is this that your approach could also be adjusted in a way so that it could also check whether chatbots need an upgrade or
Yeah,
improvement or not? But
100%.
I think the set of questions that you're having right now would not necessarily satisfy that particular goal, would they?
No, the pre-flight is focused on sort of operational type questions as
Right.
its first set of topics.
Mm.
In terms of what we're talking about with customer interactions and things like that, there are other benchmarks that are out there that are quite useful. But the
Are they
approach,
also open source?
some of them are open
Hmm.
source as well. And so taking one of those existing benchmarks or tests that are out there, and then if it's open source, you can then fork that test. So take a copy,
Hmm.
improve it for your own use case or set of areas, and then
Hmm.
adopt that within your company. Obviously, once something is open source, you have to follow the terms and conditions that go with that. But it's a really good design pattern to, you don't have to start from scratch when it comes to
Right.
using these tests. There are some good collections that are out there that you can lift, adapt to your needs, and then use them.
And I think DeepSeek has been really given this open source model quite a push. I think that is my understanding correct, or would you say? For me, it seems like really that has changed the mindset. At least
Yeah.
that was my perception.
I think that really amazed me and what that small team were able to create in such a short time was so interesting because I think it really shocked some of the other model providers what the DeepSeek team were able to achieve. It does look like I have read some articles that show perhaps they did use some of the other proprietary models to create some of the training data sets that they used in order to create that model. So there's a little bit of ambiguity about how they created their training data in order to build.
Hmm.
Nevertheless, what they were able to achieve was still shocked the market and was seen as a huge achievement, and followed up with they published technical reports on some of the techniques that they followed, and now those techniques have been adopted across the world. So they created brand new ways of understanding how models can think aloud, and that they had the first model that showed its reasoning like a scratch
Hmm.
pad of what it was thinking as it reasoned across a question. They were the first company to actually show that as part of the model output. And
Interesting.
yeah, that's fascinating. Those
And I think it really definitely changed the way OpenAI handled its business, right? I think now my most recent information was that they even want to walk away from the for-profit approach to a not-for-profit
Yeah,
approach.
I saw that. That's interesting.
Those may be related. I do not know how they may be related, but I
I
would
think
say,
that, well, partly I think they had some, they have a complicated corporate structure. So
yeah.
that's not a controversial statement.
Mm,
Changing their status to a for-profit involved some quite complicated legal changes. And
mm.
I think that there were even some lawsuits trying to stop them from doing that. And I don't know any of the background or anything, but I heard the news that they perhaps had taken a step back from doing that change for now. But I think the question about open source is separate from that. I think I'm a big fan of
Mm.
open source, and I think it's very positive to use that approach. I think open source, I don't think we've had enough open source in aviation, actually. There's very many proprietary products and systems, and I think doing some more open source work within aviation would be very positive. I don't think we've had enough.
But also, this is something that we touched in the discussion with Abhishek Krishna from Amadeus, basically confirming something that you have said before, that first of all, collaboration is the data is very important, and that the collaboration between the different players in the aviation world, that it seems their willingness to collaborate in terms of data sharing is more, that it's happening more, and that they are more willing to do this, and that it leads to some improvements in operations.
Yes and no. I think where the incentives, I'm going to talk like an economist now, so I hope I'll get marks from you, Professor. Where the incentives are aligned, then collaboration happens. I think that, so where particular commercial incentives line up, the big companies do collaborate with smaller.
Along supply chains, I think he made some example, airports and airlines, for instance, or airports and public transportation companies.
Yes. So where there's a safety regulation, absolutely safety first. That's something that's been communicated to me and fully support is the safety first, the principles
Mm,
of how we've built everything in aviation. I'm very, proud of that and support it 100%. So whereas the safety is involved, the collaboration is without question. It's as soon as you get to the commercial side, if somebody is trying to create a new system or a new software product, an airline for an airport for an ANSP, then it gets complicated because getting access to the data you might need, it
mm,
may not be in the commercial interest of those
right,
stakeholders to share data with you, or for free. Often this data has good commercial value, and so
right.
the incentives have to align to get access to that.
Right. But it seems that this is sort of gradually, at least his impression and the examples that he gave, that it seems that there are more cases happening, more such examples can be found today than compared to what we had in the past.
I would love to collaborate with Amadeus and work with some of their data, and that would be awesome to do some fun things with them. So there's an open invitation there. Is it happening more? I think as the market, as the availability of data is widened, then there will be more collaboration because people have access to it. So something like FAA SWIM and the Eurocontrol NMB2B, two big systems run in the US by the FAA and Eurocontrol Network Manager. They have the B
Hmm.
web services. And so if you are a bona fide stakeholder in aviation, a real business looking to improve things, you can get access to a lot of operational data.
Hmm.
I offer a very low price, and there's a very fair licensing agreement with those
Hmm.
organizations. And so you can get access to data and do cool things, other initiatives, make R&D data available. So Eurocontrol do an R&D, so research and development data snapshot, where they
Hmm.
provide a lot of data for academics and industry to play with and learn from and explore. So that's cool stuff, and
Hmm.
that does encourage collaboration
Hmm.
and new research and new ideas. Still think there's work to do though. in terms of small businesses being able to access data from bigger companies who keep it very tightly under commercial lock and key. So I think there's more that we could do.
Yeah, I think not sure this is exactly falls into the category that you are having in mind. But if you, as a researcher, you will find that there's a lot of research of US aviation markets. And this is because you can get very detailed information data about the US aviation markets, even including prices.
Oh,
There is a so-called DB1B, 10% data sample, 10% of this big market, right? I think is it the biggest domestic market still, or has China overtaken the US already? But I think they're relatively close. So definitely the US was until just recently the biggest domestic aviation market, and a 10% sample is
yeah.
it's a lot of data. And beyond that, there's a lot of information available. And we really hope, actually, as a scientist, we would hope that Europe follows a similar approach and detailed information about aviation markets, because it just allows um, much better understanding of what's going on, how competition affects market outcomes, for instance. Or when we talk about airports, European aviation market is pretty special when it comes to airport market. One reason is are the ownership models. There is no other region in the world that is as rich in terms of diversity of ownership models, like combining public and private airport ownerships, different types of regulations, and so forth. So I think if such data sets would be extremely helpful in much better understanding of basically how airport management or ownership models and regulations affect the efficiency, markets and the outcome, number of passengers, prices, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So Eurocontrol do publish a huge amount of data on their website, and so in terms of, I don't know if they have specifically passenger numbers, maybe they do, but they do have a huge amount on their website for both R&D, and they have ANSP performance analytics and dashboards that are available to engage with and look at very rich data sets there, which is really cool to see.
All right. Anything missing till
Yeah.
now? We have covered a lot of material.
Yeah.
And I really think the main lessons for aviation stakeholders, I really think two of the main lessons have been, okay, this discussion is how what you do basically contributes to how aviation professionals should be interacting with large language models, and also how these can also help them. Basically, your approach can help them understand better how to adjust to new versions or
Yeah. How treat them with caution, and how to test them so that you can validate that the model is able to answer the questions you want it
right.
to answer.
And I think another lesson is basically encouraging everyone who is interested in contributing to this, to use of this open source
Oh yeah.
code and contribute, basically
Uh,
participate in
uh,
making this better, the system.
yeah, participate. And it's open to academics just as much as professionals. Actually, I think academics by training are good at asking hard questions. So I think that's particularly of interest to bring in. Also, topics that not just operational questions and the rules for operations, because that's where we've spent some good effort so far. We're
Mm.
really interested in the subtopics away from operations in other areas, and look forward to any contributions. Very welcome, and comments and errors that are spotted that I can improve through the governance of the data set, just as much as new questions.
Great. All right. Good. So, yeah, I will have a